Hey everyone, Oppo just released their newest high-end mid-ranger, the Oppo Reno3 Pro 5G. This is also one of the most confusingly named phones that I've ever come across, as it's the same phone as the Find X2 Neo, but a completely different phone from the Oppo Reno3 Pro non-5G. Confusing naming aside, it has a 90Hz display, a good chipset, and a promising camera setup. So is this the mid-ranger that you should buy? I'm Angie for GS Marina, and this is our review of the Oppo Reno3 Pro 5G. Despite not being one, the Reno3 Pro 5G has the looks and in-hand feel of a flagship phone. It has Gorilla Glass 5 panels on the front and back that curve seamlessly toward the aluminum frame, with no awkward ridges to ruin the experience. There's a gradient paint job on the back, and the 4-camera setup doesn't stick out too much. The Reno also has a cute hat trick, or rather bottom trick, because the bottom of the phone is flat and can stand up on its own. More importantly, the ergonomics of this phone are fantastic. It's thin, light, and bottom heavy, so it's really comfortable in the hand and it's more difficult for it to topple over as you're using it. The Reno loves fingerprints and can be a little slippery. As far as durability goes, the phone feels solid and well made, but it's still glass and there's no IP protection as far as we know. Speaking of fingerprints, the optical fingerprint reader is flawless, as it's fast, accurate, and responsive. On the front, you'll find that the display has a punch hole in the upper left corner and gently curved edges with minimal color shift. This isn't always the case with curved screens, so it's nice to see. Other than that, the 6.5-inch AMOLED panel itself has a Full HD Plus resolution and a 90Hz refresh rate, joining the increasing number of phones that offer a buttersmooth experience in this sense. We got a maximum of 510 nits in manual mode and 544 nits in auto. Depending on what you're looking at, you might struggle with sunlight legibility if it's a really bright day. Color accuracy was middle of the road with bluish whites. Sadly, there's no HDR here either. The Reno3 Pro 5G has a stereo speaker setup with a downward-facing speaker on the bottom and one hiding in the top bezel of the phone. Loudness is above average, while sound quality was adequate. There's not much bass, which isn't much of a surprise considering the size of these speakers, but vocals were crystal clear. With 4,025 mAh, the Reno3 Pro 5G has an average battery capacity for 2020. But surprisingly, it got 100 hours of endurance on our tests with the 90Hz mode switched on, which is a great result. The 30-watt VOOC charger allowed for some impressive charging as well. You'll get from 0 to 72% in half an hour and a full charge in only 48 minutes. The Reno has a Snapdragon 765G chipset and either 8 or 12 gigs of RAM. That G in the name is supposed to signify that it's more gaming oriented, though we found that in general it was quite similar in performance to the regular 765. It's more than good enough for day-to-day use and performed at more or less the same level as the Mi Note 10 Lite and the LG Velvet. The Reno3 Pro 5G has ColorOS 7 on top of Android 10, which is quite the jump from ColorOS 6. Looks-wise, the UI is more stockish, and it offers a cleaner overall experience. It's also incredibly customizable. You can switch up the always-on display, which Oppo is calling screen off clock for some reason, change up the edge light effects for different notifications, and you'll also find a system-wide dark mode. You'll find 3 types of navigation options, classic buttons, and 2 types of gestures. You can either swipe from the bottom or swipe in from the sides, which is more akin to stock Android 10 gestures. You can also choose what happens when you swipe down in the middle of the home screen. Either you can bring up the global search like before, or you can have it bring down the notification shade. I prefer the latter because it makes for a smoother one-hand experience. The Reno3 Pro 5G has 3 proper cameras on the back. There is a 48-megapixel main sensor with an f1.7 aperture, a 13-megapixel telephoto that offers 2x zoom, an 8-megapixel ultra-wide camera, and of course the 2-megapixel depth sensor. In daylight, the main camera produces images that were adequate but nothing breathtaking. The processing is good for social media with high contrast, punchy colors, and an alright dynamic range, and a high level of detail. That said, you'll notice some sharpening halos around foliage, some noise in the shadows, and overall lower exposures. Pictures look dark even under bright sunlight. The telephoto had similar processing to the main camera in terms of exposure, colors, and noise. At 2x zoom, they're plenty sharp, but at 5x, they're surprisingly quite usable too. The ultra-wide camera has more saturated colors than the other two, and had slightly softer images and color fringing in some areas. Still, the dynamic range, lens corrections, and even levels of detail were pretty great. In low light, we were pleasantly surprised by the main camera's performance. Even without night mode, images look sharp with plenty of detail in the shadows and highlights. Noise is minimal and colors look accurate. When you switch night mode on, you get a sharper image with less noise, better dynamic range, and an impressive level of detail in shadows and highlights. There are some halos around straight lines, but it's still great performance for social media. To our surprise, the phone uses the telephoto for zoom photos rather than cropping in from the main sensor. Images are softer and there is more noise in the darker parts of the image, but dynamic range and the level of detail were very good. With night mode on, the telecam produced shots with even more detail and some much needed sharpness. For its class, the ultrawide performed decently in low light. It wasn't particularly sharp and there was quite a lot of noise, so we definitely recommend using the night mode. Night mode shots had more detail, brighter shadows, and much more sharpness. In fact, with this mode turned on, it's one of the best ultrawide snappers in low light for the money. Portraits were really nice. The edge detection is pretty accurate and skin tones look natural. The HDR was very effective and worked even under direct sunlight. Selfies were a bit of a mixed bag. They had consistent colors but less than stellar sharpness. Selfie portraits actually look more crispy, even in scenarios with less lights, and they had good edge detection. This is because they were downscaled to 8 megapixels. The Reno3 Pro 5G can shoot 4K videos at up to 30 FPS. Footage was sharp with good dynamic range, natural colors, and no noise. There is an ultra-steady stabilization mode that shoots at a rather odd 50 frames per second. Surprisingly, we like the 4K stabilized footage more than the one in Full HD. That said, if you do choose to go the Full HD route, the processing seems very similar to the 4K version. Oppo has produced a really good phone with 5G connectivity, a flagship feel, and good features. Unfortunately, its brand name is not enough for it to stand out in the West-saturated market. 5G isn't even available in every country yet, so for many people this won't be a point worth considering. There are also quite a few phones at its price that have better chipsets, like the Poco F2 Pro, the Realme X50 Pro, and the Samsung Galaxy S10 Lite. Since this is a very good device, if the price drops significantly, then you should consider this as a mid-ranger, but until then, it's a little hard to recommend. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.